By the time the certified letter arrived, the future I'd sketched in pencil, sunlit kitchen, wider doorway, a place for my aging mother, collapsed into one sharp sentence: denied. They didn't know the reasons pulsing beneath our floorboards. They didn't know me, but I would make them listen. Before winter ended completely, the envelope came like bad weather, branded with the HOA's navy crest, the paper stiff and expensive, the ink immaculate. It sat in the mailbox like a dare, half buried under circulars and a grocery flyer advertising peaches we wouldn't see for months. The sky had pulled tight over Cedar Ridge, the kind of February gray that felt like a ceiling you could bang your head on. Our porch boards creaked in familiar protest as I stepped up, letter in hand, all the warmth of the kettle I'd left whistling behind the door fading from memory. Noah saw it before I said a word. Did they? I don't know. I did, though. The way my name was machine-stamped, the way the address was so perfectly centered you could balance a level on it, order as threat. I slit the flap carefully, as if gentleness might soften whatever was inside. Dear Ms. Abram, it began, in a font that had the weirdly polite tone of a person judging your shoes. The words marched down the page with military discipline. We regret to inform you, your proposed modifications, in conflict with the architectural guidelines, change to the front elevation, non-conforming window style, ramp visible from the street, denial. It wasn't just a no. It was a tidy paragraph of refusals wrapped in legal citations. At the bottom, Patricia Lanier's signature, with the flattened flourish of a woman who had signed 1,000 denials and never once broken a pen. My ears filled with the sea roar of my pulse. I had pictured a different day, laughter, blue tape, marking possibilities on our hardwood floors. My mother's suitcase tucked just inside the door. Instead, the living room around me seemed to withdraw, bare walls leaning in a fraction as if to listen. Noah read over my shoulder. You've got to be kidding me. I set the letter on the table and smoothed it until it lay like a pressed leaf. They said the ramp would negatively impact community aesthetics. He barked a single humorless laugh. So would inheriting everyone's broken hips when they can't get into their own houses. I caught myself tapping the edge of the letter to the rhythm of "My mother can't climb stairs." Words like that can feel like begging if you say them out loud. I hadn't begged anyone since I was 12 in a school office asking for another day with a library book. But here I was, 37, and there was a salt taste at the back of my throat that reminded me of the hallway outside a hospital room. When we bought the house, cream siding, modest porch, an old oak in a yard that surrendered to dandelions no matter how virtuously we weeded. I fell in love with the sound the wind made in the ash trees behind us. It was a soft, rivering sound, a promise that nothing stayed stuck forever. The kitchen was small, the countertops a kind of beige that tried and failed to be cheerful, but we saw what it could become. The first time I put a tape measure to the dining room wall, imagining the kitchen opening like a held breath, I traced a path in my mind. A wider doorway, my mother's hand on my arm, no wobble or flinch at the threshold. We hadn't done this on a whim. I had filed the application. I had drawn the plans as carefully as I had once drawn the cross-hatching on a 7th-grade portrait that won me a county ribbon. I sat at the kitchen table with the architectural guidelines on my laptop, reading that ramps were permitted when minimally visible, that window replacements must be compatible with the aesthetic. Fine, we had chosen black-clad casements, simple, clean. The bump-out, a modest 3 feet, would disappear behind the hydrangea. The contractor had nodded and said, "This is reasonable." My optimism was a practical tool, not a joke. Mom was still at her apartment, where the elevator was sometimes as reliable as faith. Her knees were a rumor of storms coming in, the cartilage gone where the pain nested. We had timed everything like you time a cake, knowing the window when it will rise and when it will fall. Surgery scheduled, recovery planned, the contractor ready. All of it hinged on the permission of people I had never shared a potluck with. Noah turned the letter over, as if some gentler message might be hiding on the back. "We can appeal, right?" I swallowed. We have 15 days. Then we appeal. The certainty in his voice snagged my breath. 15 days. I saw them as fence posts driven into frozen ground. After he went back to the kettle and the task of making perfectly ordinary tea for a panicking person, I sat and read the letter again. Slowly. The citations were a thicket. CC&R 4.3.1, 5.2.7, Appendix B. They used phrases like congruity and streetscape, as if we were a painting and our front yard a museum hung with silent rules. They pointed out that the ramp would be readily visible. They quoted the guideline about maintaining architectural uniformity, a phrase I'd begun to hate. The way I hate the smell of scorched toast, more for what it signals than what it is. That night, after we ate toast anyway and pretended the crisping was intentional, I dug out the binder with the CC&Rs, its plastic sleeve cloudy with the fingerprints of previous owners. I sat cross-legged on the living room rug and began to read. The house creaked around me the way I imagine bones creak in a body that's almost asleep. I highlighted in yellow, in pink, in green, until the sections sat on the page like bruised fruit. There were exceptions. Of course there were exceptions. Disability accommodations will be considered with reasonable leniency, it said, which read to me like a trapdoor disguised as a promise. There was a list of approved paint colors, longer than the Lord's Prayer, and notes on fences that were as strict as toddler bedtime routines. Then in the minutes of a meeting from 2018 I found it. Lot 19 approved for rear sunroom addition with modification to roofline. A change in silhouette granted. And a photograph from a newsletter. Neighbors smiling beside a new set of French doors, black frames like ours would be. The caption calling it tasteful. I pulled the binder closer, my knees aching in their own quiet language, my heart doing that rabbit thing it does when scenting both fear and solution. They weren't against change. They were against mine. Or mine made them nervous, or mine was simply the kind of change that had to be pressed into the shape of a precedent and presented like a gift they hadn't realized they wanted. At nearly midnight, the ice maker rattled in the freezer and made me jump so hard I laughed, out loud. The house was ridiculous at that hour. Everything had sharp edges. The email I began to draft to the board was a story and a diagram and a plea. I wrote sentences and backed them up and wrote them again. We are seeking to accommodate a medical necessity. The ramp will be constructed with wood matching the existing porch. The proposed windows are congruent with numerous examples in the neighborhood, including Lot 19. When my mother called the next day, her voice was a small, brave flame. How are we looking, kiddo? I took the call standing by the sink, the cold metal pressing into my hip. We got a denial, I said, and felt the truth drop between us like a coin into a fountain where your wishes go to die. A pause. Then, do I need to wait? No, we're going to appeal. I pinched the bridge of my nose, the habit of a person who once believed tension could be funneled out through narrowed bones. It just means more words. Well, she said, with that dry humor I cling to, you always were good with those. Later, I walked the block because sitting felt like drowning. Mrs. Patel waved from behind her evergreen hedge, pruners in hand. Mr. Ruiz's garage door was open, a heart pinned back to show its ribs. Anita, who lived in the corner lot with the tulip flag that made me smile in April, paused with her dog. She took in my face like a doctor. They said no, didn't they? How did you? They always do first. She leaned in, confiding, her breath fogging the cold air. Patricia doesn't like being surprised. Appeals go better when you wear her down with facts and sweet talk. Bring pictures. Bring polite rage. Also, do not let her talk over you. Is it that bad? It's that personal. Anita's dog sneezed and shook his ears. But you have allies. Daniel on the board? He's new. He actually listens. And the ARC chair, Greta, is reasonable when Patricia lets her be. Just go in. Ready, and don't let them tell you your mother is a design problem. They use euphemisms. Something in my chest unkinked a fraction. Allies. I could work with that. It was easier to fight shadows when you knew their outlines. On my porch, a folded note waited under the doormat, a corner sticking out like a tongue. The paper was from a yellow legal pad. The handwriting was slanted, determined. "Don't bother," it read. "They never say yes." The words were so bald they made me laugh. The laugh broke halfway through and became something else, something like a growl swallowed. I stood with the note in my hand, the oak above shrugging off a few ice pearls with sound like brittle applause. The air had that tinny cold that makes conversations feel quick and alone. Somewhere, a garage band teenager practiced, the same riff in a loop, the repetition oddly comforting. I crumpled the note and then smoothed it again because I wanted to remember the feel of it when we won. When, not if. I took it inside and pinned it on the corkboard above the desk where we were currently storing receipts and the postcard of a beach we had not visited. It looked absurd next to a recipe for apricot chicken. That night I printed photographs. Lot 19 sunroom from the newsletter. The black frame doors on Cedar Court. The podcast advice I'd scrawled on the flip side of a bill. Appeal to policy, not people. Then, appeal to people, not policy. Both could be true. I wrote a list titled Strategy, and beneath it a smaller one titled Faith. The second list was empty until I added, Mom's laugh. Noah leaned in the doorway. "You're on fire." "I'm cold," I said, but I knew what he meant. He kissed my temple. 15 days. 14, I corrected, and watched his eyebrows lift. "They count the day you receive the letter." For the first time since, the envelope landed like a bird with ugly intentions. I felt something besides helplessness. It was a clean, bright edge. Resolve. It made the living room look slightly different, as if a window had been washed while I wasn't watching. I sent the appeal notice at 11:03 p.m., the blue bar sliding across my screen like a horizon, somewhere between my delivery confirmation and the hum of the heat kicking on. I imagined the board members with their coffee mugs and their certainty. I imagined walking into that room and introducing them to my future like it was a person I loved. I imagined their faces as I unfolded my map. By the time the hearing date landed in my inbox, winter thawed just enough to show the mud beneath. I sharpened my facts like knives and tucked my heart behind them. They would talk about symmetry, street view, precedent. I would talk about my mother and the law. And fairness. The email came early. A polite ping that set the tone for a day of pacing. Your appeal has been scheduled for March 3rd at 7 p.m. Please bring supporting materials. It would be held at the clubhouse, which was a grand term for a long beige room with folding chairs and a well-meaning ficus that had never not looked thirsty. We had, by then, a small war chest, printed photographs of similar windows in the Yar neighborhood, the minutes from Lot 19 sunroom approval, a letter from Dr. Lang stating in soft medical certainty that my mother requires safe, step-free egress, a page I'd highlighted in a HUD FAQ about reasonable modifications under the Fair Housing Act, a mouthful that made me feel like a person carrying a very sharp needle through a crowded room. I had a mock-up sketch I'd learned to love, and then fear. Its lines too neat, too hopeful. At night, I lay awake and mentally walked the ramp. 3 rises, 2 landings, a gentle slope, the handrails smooth enough that her grip would not catch. I heard the way her breath would sound on the landing, that little gust that is not quite a sigh. I thought of the phrase, visible from the street, as if my mother's need were indecent. Noah became a one-man production team. He made a slide, deck that would never see a projector because the HOA admired paper and suspicion, but it helped me rehearse. He took photos from the sidewalk with his phone at chest height, his Patricia's eye view, circling them with text. Ramp screened, by hydrangea. Ramp stained to match porch. We bought 2 trellises from the hardware store and propped them in the yard on a rare sunlit Saturday. We stood across the street and squinted. "See?" he said, and the wind tugged hair into my mouth like a joke. Anita brought over brownies and stories. They tried to tell the Thompsons they couldn't put in a pergola because it would suggest year-round leisure, she said, incredulous. licking frosting from her thumb. Like rest is a criminal act. She had lived here long enough to have archives. She texted me videos of previous meetings, the tone, the micro-expressions. In one, Patricia leaned back, arms crossed over a sweater the color of wet cement, eyes like a gate that won't move even when you ask nicely. The second anonymous note came on a Monday. Same yellow paper, same slanted hand. This is not a hospital. I stood in the gray light of the kitchen and felt two things clash: grief and fury. I folded it into a small, mean square and slid it behind the corkboard's frame. Let it sit like a pressed insect, a reminder. Mom called that night to tell me about a near fall. Nothing happened, she said too quickly. I am not porcelain. No, I said. You're steel. I told her about the meeting. I made my voice sound like a steady plank. She breathed out. I've been practicing with the cane. You know. I know. I closed my eyes so I could picture her apartment, the low couch, the rug with the threadbare patch, the elevator with its suspicious hum. We're going to do this right. 2 days before the meeting, I called a number I had scribbled under strategy, the county's fair housing office. An intake counselor named Selena listened as I explained the denial letter and our design. Her voice was practical and kind. HOAs have to allow reasonable modifications at the owner's expense, she said. They can request information. They can negotiate appearance, but they can't say no just because of aesthetics. Use that phrase, reasonable modification, under the FHA. Bring the doctor's note. Offer to screen, offer to maintain, and keep a record. I'm not ready to, make it a case. I traced the grain of the desk with my nail until a splinter lifted like a warning. I want them to hear me as a neighbor. Of course, she said, but if they don't, call us back. You're not alone. I printed her email. Just seeing the government emblem made me breathe easier. The way you feel different when a friend shows up and leans against the kitchen counter with a look. The day of the meeting arrived brittle and bright. The oak inn, the front yard, wore the smallest possible suggestion of buds, tight fists on every branch. I dressed like I was both going to an interview and to court. The navy dress with pockets big enough to hold evidence, the scarf my mother knit in a time when her hands still sang through wool. I tucked our presentation into a binder and then into another binder as if paper could be armor. The clubhouse hummed like a hive before the queen arrives. Neighbors milled, adjusting coats, clutching their own manila folders. The agenda, printed, on white paper with the HOA crest in tasteful miniature, listed us as Item 4, Exterior Modification Appeal, Lot 12. Before us, a complaint about holiday lights still up on Pine Meadow Drive and a discussion of front yard ornamentation, prompted by a family of ceramic gnomes that had clearly united and multiplied. Patricia sat at the head of the collapsible table at the front, already composed, hair a helmet. Beside her, Greta, the ARC chair, leafed through a file with the calm eyes of someone assembling a puzzle. Daniel, whom I recognized from Anita's description, tall, cardigan, the air of a person who apologizes when other people bump into him, smiled when my gaze caught his. I held that smile like a coin. We listened as the gnome couple defended their tiny community with surprising eloquence. The Holiday Lights family promised to take the reindeer down. By this weekend, cross our hearts. Laughter cracked the ice. It helped. Then, Item 4, Patricia said, and the room straightened. I stood. I felt my feet in my shoes the way you do right before you run or jump. My voice began too small, then found itself. Thank you for hearing us, I said. My name is Leah Abram, Lot 12. We're seeking approval for a modest kitchen window, replacement, a 3-foot bump out that remains within setback, and a front ramp constructed to match the existing porch for my mother, who will be living with us after surgery. I slid the doctor's note across. We're requesting a reasonable modification under the Fair Housing Act. Patricia's eyebrows did something I filed as a flicker. We are aware of the act, she said, as if I had insulted her personally. Our concern is neighborhood uniformity. which the guidelines acknowledge while also allowing accommodations. I placed the photographs, Lot 19 sunroom, the black framed doors on Cedar Court. Neighbors with similar alterations have been approved. Our windows match the style in the community. The ramp will be stained to match the porch, screened, with lattice and plantings, and designed to be as unobtrusive as function allows. Greta leaned forward. Can you show us the side elevation of the ramp? I did. My hand steadied as I pointed to the landing, resetting like a gentle breath. Here and here. The rail height is code compliant at 36 inches. The run is 1 foot per inch of rise. Daniel spoke for the first time. I walked by your lot, he said, flushing a little. From the street, if the trellises and shrubs are in place, I, had to squint to see the outline. A murmur rose from the rows of chairs, the sound of 50 people adjusting an opinion by degrees. Then the other sound, clearing throats, a person in the back, lifting a finger. Her name turned out to be Margaret, and she wore a brooch shaped like a leaf pinned like a medal. With respect, she said, and you could feel how much respect she did not mean. If we allow a ramp at the front of one house, soon there will be all kinds of things in front yards. It affects property values. It signals decline. Anita stood before I could. What it signals, she said, sharp and bright, is that we are a neighborhood where people can age without humiliation. Mr. Ruiz raised his hand, eyes soft. My father visits with a walker. He hasn't come since Christmas because of the stairs. I would like to visit again, he added. And the simplicity of it made something complicated unravel in the room. Patricia tapped her pen. We appreciate the community input. Our guidelines specify that ramps should be minimally visible from the street. I kept my voice measured, which is why we've designed it to be low profile, stained to match, and screened with plantings. We'll maintain those plantings at our expense. We are not asking for specialness. We're asking for safety. Greta's gaze slid to Patricia. The windows? Patricia pursed. The black frames are contemporary. So are half the kitchens in this neighborhood, Daniel said gently. A few laughs broke the tension. He spread his hands. They're compatible, and the bump out is within setbacks. Patricia disliked being laughed at, even kindly. We'll need more assurance that the ramp will not dominate the elevation, she said, finding refuge in the word elevation the way some people find it in prayer. Noah, who had stood silent and watchful, slipped a photograph from the back of our stack and laid it down. This is the view from across the street, he said. It was his best one, the angle exact, the trellises in place, our porch looking like a stage that remembered summer. The ramp's edge was a suggestion more than a demand. Greta nodded. I'd like to propose conditional approval, she said. Careful but clear. Patricia's head snapped. Greta went on. Approval for the window replacements and bump out as submitted, and conditional approval for the ramp, contingent on screening as shown and painted lattice skirting, with the understanding that any deviation returns to ARC. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it. You could see her counting votes with her eyes like beads. Greta, maybe Daniel, the member whose name I didn't know who had spoken only to grant the gnomes a stay of execution. She pressed her lips flat. We will, excuse me, I said, and it was both foolish and necessary. May I show you one more thing? She frowned. Briefly, I took out the photograph I had debated all afternoon. My mother last spring, sitting on a bench beneath the flowering cherry near the library, her head tipped back to catch a drift of petals. Her face was joy without condition. It wasn't argument. It was context. I didn't pass it to them like a weapon. I simply rested it on the table near the picture of our front porch with its neat trellises. The room got very quiet in a way that was not about fear. Patricia looked at it longer than I expected. When she raised her eyes, something in them had shifted a half inch. Not a capitulation, a recognition. We will deliberate, she said, voice even. We will notify you in writing within 10 business days. I gathered our papers with fingers that did not quite obey me. Spines creaked, staples glinted. People touched my arm. Anita squeezed my shoulder the way you do when you want to transmit battery power from one body to another. Outside, the air bit like an apology you can almost accept. On the porch that night, a dusting of snow arrived, delicate as lint. Under the porch light, the trellises threw long diagonal shadows, exactly like the ones we'd measured. I stood there, longer than the cold allowed. The house hummed around me, a creature with a heartbeat I had finally matched. 10 days, Patricia had said. 10 days can be an ocean you can drown in or a bridge you can run across. I slept like a person trying to do both at once. 10 business days became the longest measurement I'd ever held. I learned the length of a breath, the weight of the mailbox lid, the sound a neighborhood makes when it is deciding what kind of place it wants to be. On the 10th, the envelope returned, heavier than before, waiting. The first day was fine. I had the leftover adrenaline from the hearing to live on. I wrote thank you texts. I wiped down already clean counters. I rearranged the stack of documents, the guidelines, Dr. Lang's letter, the photographs into a new order, as if the case might need to be made again at my kitchen table. On day 3, winter thawed just enough to turn the sidewalks into an argument between ice and grit. The oak out front made a noise like a congregation clearing its throat. I walked past Anita's to return her brownie pan and got pulled into a conversation about whether crocuses were foolish optimists or prophets. She squeezed my arm. "If they don't approve, we push," she said, as if we were moving a car, stuck in the snow. On day 5, Daniel sent a message. "Can't discuss specifics, but the committee is reviewing. Your materials were very helpful." He added a smiley that looked like a person trying to remain professional while remembering what sunlight feels like. It was nothing, and it was not nothing. I replied with a thank you and a photograph of our porch at dusk, the trellises casting their long, quiet selves across the steps. I deleted it before sending. No lobbying, I reminded myself, and then laughed because everything felt like lobbying now. The porch, the sky, the way my mother's cane leaned in the corner like a promise. Mom started packing. "Just the small things," she said, as if you can ever measure your life in small things. I drove over and carried boxes to the trunk, framed photos, a florid teapot that whistled like an opera singer on bad nights, the lap blanket knit in the color of storm water. We labeled the cartons with a shaky shorthand. LR, BRK. She rested twice on the way to the elevator and waved me away both times, the way you wave a fly from your light. On day 7, I found a third note, not yellow this time, but tucked into the edge of our mailbox like a hard letter caught in soft teeth. Nothing personal, it read. We all follow rules. I noticed the absence in it, the missing period at the end, like maybe the writer hadn't quite finished following through. I slid it into the corkboard frame with the others and went to the hardware store for lattice and paint, in a shade with a name like Sparrow Wing. The clerk asked what I was building, and I said, a bridge, because sometimes you have to call a thing by the right name to carry it across. Noah took to making me tea with absurd seriousness. Each cup arrived with the gravity of a ceremony. 10 days is just 2 weekends, he said on day 8, and I wanted to kiss him and also point out that some weekends hold entire wars. On the 10th morning, I startled awake at 5 and watched the ceiling turn from barely blue to low-shouldered gray. The kettle's whistle sounded like a story remembered halfway through. I told myself not to be waiting when the mail truck came, and then of course I stood at the window like a kid anticipating a different kind of miracle. The mailbox's lid clanged. The envelope had our HOA's Navy crest and that precise address. You could level a shelf by. Wait, Noah said, appearing at my elbow with a steadiness that almost undid me. Here. We sat at the dining table. I slit the flap carefully and unfolded the letter. The words, which had been a forest last time, were a field this time. They were navigable. Dear Ms. Abram, it began, which I was beginning to think of as the HOA's version of hello and goodbye and everything in between. The paragraph that followed was not a hug, but it was not a slap. The board had voted approval for the window replacements and the 3-foot bump out as submitted. Conditional approval for the ramp, contingent on the following. Matching stain, painted lattice skirting, hydrangea and evergreen screening as indicated. Completion within 90 days. Return to ARC if any element changed significantly, and final inspection by the committee upon completion. At the bottom, Patricia's signature had a little more curl in it. Or maybe I imagined the softness. It didn't matter. I read the word approved twice, then a third time because I didn't trust my eyes. My breath did a strange thing. It didn't gasp or rush. It lengthened, like someone had opened a window somewhere inside me. Noah whooped. It was indecorous and exactly right. I was already crying, silent tears that were not dramatic, but that fell, true as small coins. I pressed my fingers to the paper until the fibers warmed under my skin. Then, I called my mother. Approved, I said. Conditional but approved. For a second she didn't say anything. Then I heard a wet, unguarded sound that made me love the whole flawed world. I would like, she said, steadying herself on the vowels, to come home. The contractor slotted us in for the following Monday. The kitchen became a staging area for lumber. The smell of raw wood filled the house, bright and green. The crew parked their truck by the curb like a proclamation. Hammers sounded like arguments and apologies, and then eventually like routine. Sawdust drifted in the sunlight like proof you can see. When they cut the angle for the first landing, it felt like geometry saving a life. Neighbors came and went, curious, supportive, nosy, generous. Anita brought thermoses of coffee and a bag of oranges, insisting both were essential construction. Fuel. Mr. Ruiz wheeled out a shop vac that could have picked up a scandal. Mrs. Patel signaled approval by way of a nod that looked small and felt enormous. Even Margaret of the Leaf Brooch walked by twice, the second time with her gaze softer, as if she'd been practicing a different way to see. On the third afternoon, a maroon sedan slowed and parked across the street. Patricia stepped out in a coat the color of foxglove, Greta beside her in gray. My stomach performed a small, unnecessary acrobatics routine. Noah squeezed my hand, left a thumbprint of sawdust on my knuckle, and whispered, "You've got this." They didn't announce themselves, just watched for a minute, heads tilted. Greta pointed to the lattice, nodded. Patricia's expression was as inscrutable as a closed book. Then she came up the path, careful not to step on a hose, and stopped, 2 feet from the ramp as if respecting a boundary invisibly painted. "Ms. Abram," she said. "Leah." "Patricia," I said, letting the name be a bridge instead of a fence. "The stain matches well," she observed. She looked at the trellises, the hydrangea stubs promising green. "I appreciate the screening." "Thank you," I said. "We wanted it to look like it belonged here." She exhaled in a way that meant a lot of things, but mostly I think meant that belonging is harder to quantify than paint. "You made your case well," she said finally. "You made me read our guidelines again." A flicker. "We don't like to be surprised." "I hear that," I said. "I'll send a heads up for the windows when the crew schedules us." Greta smiled a small, real smile. "We'll return for the final inspection," she said, "but I anticipate no issues." After they left, I leaned against the porch post and let my body do the shaking it had put off. Noah kissed my temple and I tasted salt on my lips, the sweat of work, and also the ocean of those waiting days finally receding. The ramp completed itself in a series of increments that felt like verbs: set, fasten, plane, sand, stain. We painted the lattice sparrowwing, and it dried a shade, humbler than its name. The handrail ran smooth under my palm. I could imagine my mother's grip, the way she insists on dignity even when her knees make little thunder sounds. The windows came out in a rush of splinters and went in as clean black frames that caught the light like it had been trained for. This. The bump out, that modest 3 feet, made the kitchen breathe. Son walked across our new counter every morning and laid down like a cat. We brought my mother home on a Saturday that had Mercy in it. She arrived in my car, which she had always said looked too much like a soap bubble to be safe. She wore lipstick the color of pomegranates. The cane rested beside her and she refused the wheelchair Noah offered with a look that would have dented steel. At the bottom of the ramp, she stopped and put her palm on the newel post. "Nice work," she told it, because she thanks things that help her. The neighbor kids paused their scooters to watch. The air held spring like a held breath. We went up slowly, not as triumph but as invitation. At the landing, she rested, eyes drifting to the ash tree's small brave tassels. "I thought it would feel like a concession," she said, and her voice did not break. "It feels like a welcome." At the top, she turned and looked back at the street as if to take it in a new language. Mr. Ruiz's father had joined him on the sidewalk, wrapped in a scarf the exact shade of the evening sky. He lifted a hand. My mother lifted hers back. I felt the click of something practical and enormous finding its place. Inside, the house rearranged itself around her. The chair by the window became hers by gravitational law. The black-framed glass reflected our faces in a way that made me want to keep them clean forever. We ate soup at the table and talked about ordinances and oranges and the time she had driven us to the beach with a map that lied. That night, a folded piece of paper appeared on the porch, weighted with a small flat stone. The handwriting leaned determinedly left. It said, "I was wrong. I am sorry. Thank you for reminding us what the street is for." I didn't need to know who wrote it. It belonged to the same anonymous part of the neighborhood that had once warned me against hope. I tucked it into the corkboard's frame beside the others and let the pins do their small, steady job. When Greta and Patricia returned for the inspection, it took 10 minutes and a change I almost didn't notice. Patricia paused at the top of the ramp and put her hand on the rail. She didn't look at me when she said, "My mother hated stairs." It was not confession so much as context. I nodded as if we were both arranging flowers at a grave. "Approved," the final letter said. The ink looked like it had learned to be kinder. Spring came all at once, as if apologizing for being late. Hydrangea leaves unfurled the green of secrets. The oak made 100,000 decision points on its branches and chose yes 99,000 times. From the street you could see the ramp if you looked. I wanted you to. It meant a body could enter a house without negotiation. It meant uniformity was less important than belonging. It meant that aesthetics could include a shape made by care. Sometimes in the afternoon when the sun made a stripe across the kitchen floor, my mother would sit at the landing and lean her head back the way she had under the cherry blossoms. I'd join her and we'd listen to the neighborhood conduct itself, garage doors lifting like eyelids, laughter spooling down a block over, someone practicing scales. The ramp smelled faintly of cedar and paint, and when it rained of something richer, like the dark part of the forest. The binder of CC&Rs lives now on the bottom shelf, not because I am done with it, but because it is less necessary to hold in my hands at all times. The trellises bloom with clematis that reaches without asking permission. The black-framed windows are a line our house learned to write. Sometimes I take out the first denial letter and the last approval and lay them side by side on the table. One is the map of a world that wants to be tidy. The other is the proof that rules can be leaned on until they bend toward fairness. Between them is the ramp, visible from the street, which is exactly where it should be.